Okay, well, looks like we have about almost 20 folks on. I might have a few more drop in, but I know we're a couple minutes after 3:30, so I think we should go ahead and get started. Alex, would you like to say a few words to get us going?
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this neighborhood leaders meeting on the comprehensive plan update. This is a follow-up to our discussion at the meeting with the city manager regarding participation in the process. And we got arrangements with our consultant teams, and today they will be having a discussion with the neighborhood leaders. And hopefully after the discussion, you will take some of the information back to your neighborhood level and get your membership involved in the process. And with that, I'm gonna turn it over to Jenny.
Thanks. And Ron, if you wanna, well, actually, let's introduce ourselves first. So, hi everyone, my name is Jenny Koch, and I'm an urban planning consultant serving as project manager for Civil Plans Together. I work for RHI, Roadside in Harwell, which is a landscape architecture, urban design, and urban planning firm based in Alexandria, Virginia. Also with me today from RHI are Gina Roadside and Ron Sessoms. We also have two other folks from the consultant team on here with us today, Latoya Thomas from Bick and Story, and Lee Einsweiler from Code Studio. So you might hear from them as well. And obviously, as you can see, we have Alex Akafuna and Missy Creasy from Neighborhood Development Services. So Ron, if you want to go ahead and start sharing the slides, I'll get started. So we have a set of slides we'd like to share with you today that are similar to the webinar slides we've been using for this process. But we know some of you may have already seen those slides. We'll move fairly quickly through them, but we're happy to clarify things as we go or at the end of the presentation. One thing to note before we get started is we are recording this presentation and we will be posting it on the website along with other meetings happening during this public engagement period. So if you go to the next slide, please, Ron. This is our overall agenda. Let's see, we've got about 21 folks on today, so we're glad you can all be here to talk with us through this. We will walk through this. You can submit questions via the Q&A throughout the presentation. And you should be able to see questions that others pose through the Q&A as well. So you might want to take a look at that as they come up. We will also hopefully have time at the end of the presentation to allow some responses to any questions you pose in the Q&A from us, as well as to allow you, if you'd like to, come off of mute and share some comments. That being said, Ron, if you go to the next slide, I'll start with a bit of an update. So I think some of you probably are very familiar with Civil Plans Together. Some of you probably less familiar with it. So overall, Civil Plans Together is the name of a process. It's been going on for about a year and a half or so, and I'll go into the schedule in just a second. But there are a few specific outcomes to this process. One is that we're working to revise the city's comprehensive plan. As part of that update to the comprehensive plan, or to feed into that update, we developed an affordable housing plan that was endorsed by the City Council in March of this year, March 1st. And that document provides recommendations related to land use, as well as recommendations related to other programs and initiatives and funding that are needed to really support affordability in conjunction with land use. So we've got the affordable housing plan, the comprehensive plan update that we're working on now. And then once the comprehensive plan is approved in a future step, we will be working to rewrite the zoning ordinance to ensure that it really reflects the goals and strategies that we've incorporated in the comprehensive plan. If you want some more information about Civil Plans Together background, you're welcome to check out our website, civilplanstogether.com. To go. Well, actually, sorry, Ron, if you go back to that slide, I think it's really important to note our big goal in this process, as you can see here on this bullet, is that we are working to provide a vision for the city that has a focus on community equity as well as affordability. So you'll see that those both come up throughout the presentation. Thanks, Ron. This is the current project schedule. For those of you who have been around for a while, you may have noticed we've shifted a bit as we go. We did kick off the project in January 2020, and then our initial first phase of engagement was planned for March of 2020. And due to COVID, we ended up having to push that back a little bit, and it shifted the schedule as we went. But as you can see here, the green bar shows the Affordable Housing Plan timeline. The dark blue bar shows the Comprehensive Plan timeline, and the lighter, brighter blue bar shows the zoning rewrite timeline. The three pink boxes that you see are some of the key project updates since last time we met in a community engagement phase, which was in November of 2020. At that point, we reviewed a draft affordable housing plan and got feedback on that, as well as reviewing some of the draft initial vision statements for each chapter in the comprehensive plan. So we reviewed feedback we got from that phase, and then we updated the affordable housing plan, and as mentioned, that went to council in March of this year and for endorsement. And the third thing we've been doing, and that really plays into this current public engagement phase, is we've been revising other pieces of the comprehensive plan, including goals and strategies that address the vision statements we worked to develop with the community last year. Another big component of that we'll talk about a lot today is that we've developed a draft future land use map. So this is a draft map, and the reason we're coming out in this engagement phase through May is to get feedback on that. So Ron, if you go to the next slide, to that point, you know, we'll show this again at the end. We know you are all here today to you know, give us some of your feedback, but we hope that if you haven't already, that you'll help us share information about this process with your neighborhoods and your communities. And so there is more information at this website link, civilplanstogether.com/engage. We had a webinar on May 10th, and it's recorded and posted on the website. And there's also a webinar from May 25th, or on May 25th, that's still coming up. So you can certainly invite folks to attend that, or to use the comment form, interactive map, or other you know, comment methods that we'll describe more at the end of the presentation. Thanks, Ron. So many of you, again, may be really familiar with the comprehensive plan, but in case you're not, in general, the comprehensive plan describes and illustrates, you know, communities' goals and guides decision-making for various matters. Think transportation, housing, land use, environmental sustainability, and others. So once adopted, this is sort of the city's official statement of its intentions and policies related to land use and development. And the comprehensive plan, then the land use and other policies must be reflected in the zoning ordinance to really take effect and be regulatory. So that's why that's a key next step for us in this phase. The current comprehensive plan is from 2013. You'll see a bit more about that when we hear from Ron. And as you may know, the Planning Commission began reviewing and revising that plan in 2017, 2018, and we picked it up from there. So we will talk about that in just a second. One of the things that we heard early in this process, early last year, was that the comprehensive plan is too segmented. You know, there's a chapter on land use and a chapter on transportation and a chapter on housing, and people wanted to see a way that each of these tie together. So part of what we reviewed with the community in October and November of last year was a set of guiding principles that can apply throughout the plan, the comprehensive plan document. You see them here. They're equity and opportunity, community culture and unity, local and regional collaboration, environmental stewardship and sustainability, and connections and access. So in each chapter of the comprehensive plan, there's a set of goals, and each goal lists which one or more of these guiding principles it addresses. So we've tried to indicate how these threads go throughout the entire plan, because these are sort of what we've heard are some of the major priorities for Charlottesville. If you go, so if you go on the website, you can, in addition to the future land use map, which we know has been sort of a key thing, a key element of interest, you can also view 7 draft chapters of the plan. You can see them listed here. To create these chapters, to provide these revised chapters, we started with drafts that were created in the 2017-2018 process with the Planning Commission. And then we, using the feedback we received last year from the community, we revised the chapters to incorporate not only the affordable housing plan, other equity considerations that we've gotten, but other feedback in general. And that included working with staff at the city, as well as with the steering committee and others on that. If you take a look on the right here, you can see the general chapter structure with vision statement, goals, and strategies. I'd encourage you to, hop into any of these chapters that are of interest to you and see how that looks in the chapter. Some of the major updates to chapters that we've made are listed here, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but I would note there's a new chapter on community engagement and collaboration. So that really sort of focuses on laying out some standardized processes, ways to seek inclusive input from the community, and ways to get community groups and residents really involved in all planning processes in the city. One of the other major changes was that we combined two chapters that were previously in the document. One of them was a land use chapter, and one was an urban design and historic preservation chapter. And so you can see here, that's the second chapter listed here, land use, urban form, and historic and cultural preservation. And we've combined them because there are many ways that these elements overlap in the city of Charlottesville. And by combining them in the same chapter, we're able to provide goals that provide a more cohesive vision for this topic. The last major update I would provide is in the housing chapter. Again, that incorporates recommendations from the affordable housing plan outside of those that are related to land use, which are included in the previous chapter. And so when we talk about the fact that affordability can not only be addressed through the land use chapter, the housing chapter is where you'd want to go to see what we're talking about in terms of other policies and initiatives. So that's all I'll share about these updates for now, but we can certainly respond to any other questions later in the presentation. Otherwise, I'll pass it off to Ron to talk through land use.
Thank you, Jenny, and good afternoon, everyone. As we look to the future land use map, it's also important to understand the history and the development of the city of Charlottesville. As we all know, Charlottesville has had a very storied history. It's not a new city, it's one that's been around for a long time. It's one that had humble beginnings, particularly around the founding of the university, UVA, and the initiation of the Virginia Central Railroad in the late 1700s, early 1800s, led to the rapid development of the city. And by 1888, Charlottesville was incorporated as a city, and we know the rest is history. The city has continued to grow through the decades. One thing that is important to note in the evolution of Charlottesville, and this is something that has occurred in cities across the country. There's not many where exclusion, particularly in the era in the early 1900s, where there were practices such as redlining and racial covenants that were enacted as policy to prevent particularly those of African-American descent from living in certain areas of the city. We know that that can have a long-lasting impact in the way that the city is perceived, the way that the city is developed, and the overall socialization of a city. We know that all of these, those different negative ordinances and policies are no longer in effect. But again, they do have a lasting impact on the city regarding the way that they develop over time. In 1929, the city had its first zoning code enacted. In the early 1950s, there were more planning around the enhancement of the city, with a comprehensive plan being developed in 1958, which led to urban renewal projects that maybe you're aware of around the 1960s, which led to displacement of some residents and a demolition of several neighborhoods around the downtown area. By 1991, the city emerged thinking forward with its land use policies. By 1991, a new zoning map was developed for the city, which broadens single-family zoning. And as we know today, single-family zoning can be seen as exclusionary because it doesn't allow for a mix of different types of housing types that would allow for a variety of people of varying incomes and means to live in various areas of the city. By 2003, the city zoning code was adopted. In 2009, the current zoning code was approved. And then, of course, in 2013, the current comprehensive plan was adopted. And we are 2021, and we are working to evolve that comprehensive plan to look forward to the next 15, 20 years. So the city's not all about its history. The city has definitely continued to be a successful, vibrant city of over 50,000 people. The city is very diverse. It's comprised of over 19 neighborhood planning areas. So we know that these planning areas are more so for the purposes of internal city planning, and that there are many other neighborhoods that comprise these neighborhood planning areas. But overall, from a planning standpoint, these are generally the different districts of the city that are identified for planning purposes. Charlottesville is an important place to live. It's a very diverse housing. It has a very diverse housing composition. You can see from this diagram, this is a map of Charlottesville, and you can see the mix of different housing types, with the light purplish blue being single family residential areas, ranging up to the red parcels, which are duplexes, so on and so forth, moving up the scale to apartments. And you can see that there's really not many areas where there's a single residential land use type, which is something that's very interesting. And many of you, most of you may be aware of that, but many Charlottesville residents are not aware of how diverse the city's neighborhoods are today. The city is not only diverse based upon its housing types, but it has a very diverse demographic. We know that there's a large population of varying backgrounds within the city. And you can see from this map that shows where African Americans live. The city has a large Latino population that is heavily concentrated along the US 29 Emmett Street corridor. We know that the city varies, cities' neighborhoods vary by income, and you can see that displayed on the map as well. So these are all the different things that we look to as we think about the future land use conditions that we need to plan for. Charlottesville is a place of employment. This map, you can begin to see the darker the color, the more intensive the employment activity is. As you would imagine, areas around UVA and downtown contains the highest concentration of employment resources within the city. And then you have areas along the US 29 corridor where there's a number of retail establishments and other uses that make up a high concentration of employment activities as well. Charlottesville is a place to get around. Without transportation, we can't move, the city can't grow. This is a map of average daily traffic within the city. And you can see the darker the color, the more traffic there is within the city. We not only look to vehicular circulation, we also think about pedestrian access, transit access. The city has a robust bus transit system that really helps to alleviate the burden of vehicular traffic within the city. And another element that we look to as we begin to think of places where the city can grow and thrive. Parks and open spaces are important. The city has a broad range of different park types located in various areas of the city. And you can see in this map, the green areas represents parks. So you can see there's a high dispersion of parks. The city has a nice and complete network of parks and open spaces, as well as a robust trail network as well, which you can see in the brown, that really connect people to these parks and open spaces. The environment is important. We know Charlottesville is not flat. It has a lot of topography. It also has hydrological features such as the Rivanna River and streams such as Meadow Creek and Morris Creek, which makes it a very unique city that's nestled within abundant resources. And that's something that we have to consider, particularly the slopes, because the city does have a lot of topography, and things such as critical slopes become important as we look to where density can occur throughout the city. We also look to the tree canopy. We know that residents grow concerned about maintaining the tree canopy of the city because it's something that really defines the character of the community. When we look to the future land use planning within the city, we can't just look to ourselves. We also have to think about the region around us. This is a map that shows the urban ring, which is the area around the city. You can see all the colored land uses around the city that was developed in partly through the One Community Project that was a partnership between the city of Charlottesville and Albemarle County to look at ways that the boundaries around Charlottesville and the boundaries that meet the county can have a unified land use pattern. So that's something that we definitely look to as we think about the land uses within the city and being keenly aware of what's happening around it as well. The city has limited vacant land. In fact, the city only has around 3% vacant land left. So as you would imagine, there is pressure on the community amenities such as housing. Through the affordable housing plan, we know that there will be a continued demand for housing within the city. We know that there is development of new homes within the city occurring, but there's also a lack of housing that has been in effect for a very, very long time, particularly lack of housing related to more affordable housing options. And we know that that will continue. So we have to plan for housing. That's a very important component to the future land use map. There has been a number of plans and studies developed for the city's neighborhoods. You can see all the plans on the left. I won't go through them one by one, but you can see that there's a number of plans that we really have to think about and bring together. We don't want the future land use map, the comprehensive plan, to be a standalone document, standalone plan. We want to bring together the ideas of all of these different plans because it helps inform and helps bring cohesion to the different areas of the city as well. And you can see on the map on the right, these are some of the neighborhood plans and small area plans that have been completed or are currently underdeveloped through different processes outside the comprehensive plan. So that brings us forward to the draft future land use map. So before we get into the draft future land use map, I did want to just touch on land use versus zoning. We are in the phase of the comprehensive plan where we're looking at land use options. The plans that you will see today are not final plans by any means. We want to hear from the public. We've been getting good feedback, and we know we'll get good feedback from each and every one of you today. So this future land use map is very important. It's a very important component of the comprehensive plan. The comprehensive plan is a long-term vision for the city. The overall goal of the comprehensive plan, particularly the future land use map, is to serve as a guide for development and an overall vision of how the city could evolve into the future. It is not a legally mandatory map. However, zoning is. Zoning is an ordinance that is law. So as development projects are proposed, zoning becomes a critical part of how those projects are developed. This is an example of the current future land use map and the current zoning map. On the left, you can see the current future land use map has an array of colors, but I will point out that there's 5 development-focused land use colors on the map, which range from low-density residential to business and technology. And you can see it's fairly generalized. Most of the existing residential areas are low density with high density residential as a supplement. But if you look to the right, you can see that the zoning map is much more defined. There's much more variation of color. In fact, there are over 25 different land use categories within the zoning map. So you can see that zoning has a much higher degree of absolute definition than what the future land use map has. And we need to keep that in mind as we look forward to the concepts that I'll review, that we're at a very broad future land use stage of the planning process. The zoning rewrite is part of the process. Once we get through the future land use planning process and through the comprehensive planning, but I thought it was important to show the differences between the two and how the two are used differently. So our work is not the beginning of thinking about the future land use map for the 2021 update. Back in 2017, 2018, the previous Planning Commission began to think about where growth areas could occur, how a framework, and a framework is pretty much can be summarized as a way we look to the development of a city. In this case, how we begin to organize different principles, different ideas, and think about where growth can occur throughout the city. This is a high-level diagram from that illustrates the thinking at that time. And you can see these purple areas are what they identified as nodes, and you're going to hear the term nodes throughout the presentation. Nodes are pretty much think of as centers of gravity, centers of activity, where you can have active uses such as retail and employment areas, and even housing as well, to make kind of complete places where people live, play, and work. So you begin to see that they were beginning to conceive how the city could be organized for the future land use maps through this kind of preliminary high-level thinking about how people get to various areas of the city and where different centers of gravity, if you will, are located throughout the city. From there, there was an evolution of many variations of taking that diagram and translating it into a map. This was one of the later iterations or last iterations of the map, where you can see they've identified areas of intensity on the map. The darker the color, the more intensive the development would be. And that was something that we really looked to as a starting point, taking that thinking and beginning to evolve it as part of our work in the 2021 iteration of the future land use map. Beyond just the 2017, 2018 analysis and thinking of the future land use map, we developed a series of planning objectives. Jeannie had mentioned that we have had a series of public engagement activities throughout approximately about the last year. And from that, we began to shape objectives that help guide the way we think about that framework, and that framework that helps us conceive how we organize the city and the future land use opportunities. One, we want to integrate all of the citywide studies, small area plans, and also the 2021 Affordable Housing Plan. Two, we want to be equitable. We want to provide opportunities for density increases across the board in the city. We don't want to just look to kind of just singular areas for growth. We want to explore areas across the city to bring that, that equity to the way we think about the development of the city. We want to look to opportunities to build density or increase opportunities for people to live around amenities such as shopping, employment centers, transit parks. 4, explore the development potential of vacant and underutilized properties. Think of places like the Emmett Street corridor that has one-story commercial sites with vast parking lots. Those could be opportunities to support more urban, high-quality mixed use. We want to maximize access to public open spaces in school, establishing, building upon the relationship of the city's land uses and UVA, and also not forgetting that urban ring or the area around the periphery of the city. We want to increase access to transit and help achieve the city's climate goal. Charlottesville has a rich and storied history, as we described before, which makes it have a lot of cultural and historical resources, and we want to make sure that we think about the preservation and protection of those resources, including natural resources. And then last but not least, the city cannot thrive without economic sustainability. And that's something that is certainly important, certainly at the forefront of our mind as we think about the growth of the city. So many of you are aware that earlier this month, we released a draft for the 2021 Future Land Use Map, which you can see before you. Again, I want to iterate that this is not a final iteration of the plan. We want to hear from everyone. We want community input to help shape the way that this plan looks. And this is merely an illustration of current thinking and ideas. On the left, you can see a series of colors. We have 9 primary development land use categories that range from downtown urban core to general residential. We, in the 2013 Future Land Use Map, there were 5 land use categories. So we're getting into a lot more detail than what the 2013 plan allowed for, which we think is good. We think that provides more opportunity to get down into the weeds more and have a more defined plan that will help inform the zoning rewrite that will come after this process. And next, I'll walk through the different categories of land use. One, which many of you are certainly interested in, is residential. As we discussed earlier, there is housing pressure within the city, and we have to think about how we begin to plan for more housing opportunities. The Affordable Housing Plan charted a roadmap to how we can think about housing affordability and the future growth of the city. So we have 3 residential categories, one being general residential, which include a range of housing types scaled in context to existing single-family character. And we envision these districts to incentivize on affordability and increased intensity to, again, meet the ideals of the Affordable Housing Plan. The next stage up, we have the medium intensity residential, which will include a variety of housing type as well, and may range up to row houses, townhouses, small multi-unit buildings. Certainly some of the housing types that will fall in the general residential category as well, which I'll get into on the next slide. And again, want to incentivize on affordability to meet the goals of the Affordable Housing Plan. And then the highest intensity residential area would be those areas that would fully support multi-unit housing. Think of the university, the Venable University area along 14th Street, where we have a higher concentration of high intensity residential. That would be a good example of that category. So those are the 3 generalized residential categories. Again, these categories are broadly applied to the map. Again, keeping in mind that this is a future land use map. It's broad. It allows flexibility at the zoning stage of our work, which will happen in the next phase. And it also provides a general idea of where, in this case, residential intensity can take place throughout the city. So those residential types lie on a spectrum, and you can see a couple of examples of lower intensity on the left, higher intensity on the right, with that general residential category, including up to 3 dwelling units per lot. And that would include existing single family splits. If someone wants to split their single family home into multiple units, accessory dwelling units. For those of you who may not be as familiar with that housing type, here's an example. This would be consider the carriage house typology, where you have the primary house in the front of the lot, and then a secondary smaller unit in the back, as an opportunity to increase density within that general residential category. And we've also heard that there is some interest on limited commercial uses throughout all of the residential categories. And that's something that we can certainly see as an opportunity. The urban form, with all of these residential categories, we know they range in intensity, but we have to be respectful to the existing residential character and fabric of the city. So we want to make sure that we build in to the urban form discussion that any of these land use categories should be compatible with the existing residential and historic neighborhood context, and that the highest, most intensive buildings are only achieved where they are appropriate. And on that line of height, these three different residential categories carry different height ranges. And again, these are just ranges. When we get into the zoning, you can really drill down to the sub-districts of general residential, medium, and high, and really define what the height, the form, and the uses will ultimately be. So general residential could range up to 3.5 stories. 2 to 2.5 stories would be average, which is kind of an average height of many of the residential areas within the city. Medium intensity residential is the next step up from general residential, which may include 4 to 12 unit buildings. That's a huge range, and we know not every area that we show in brown on the map is appropriate for 12 units. It's certainly not, and that's certainly not our intent. But that medium intensity category can include small multi-unit dwellings that could accommodate 4 units per lot, up to 12, which would be the higher end of that spectrum. And that can include a variety of different housing types. And I have a couple of pictures of some of that to kind of illustrate what that could look like. For the medium intensity residential, 3 stories on average. Rare occurrences may include 4.5 stories. That's really tall. As I stated, most of the residential neighborhoods within the city is that 1.5, 2.5 character. But again, thinking about the future land use map, you do want to allow for some flexibility with that height and density and form. And then, of course, we have the high intensity residential. This is a snapshot of the University Venable area. This is 14th Street corridor. You can see a mix of multi-unit residential types, larger apartment buildings, smaller apartment buildings. But this category generally would support residential development of 13 plus units, and could include, again, larger or smaller scale buildings, and range in height up to 5 stories. A lot of you may be interested in what some of the higher intensity residential development types could look like. Here are a couple of examples of that higher intensity residential. You know, your fourplexes, your multiplexes, which would include units up to 5 plus per lot. So you can see it can come, that density can come in a variety of ranges, height, scale, architectural characters. You know, zoning does not dictate architectural character, but you can see from these images, when done correctly, that you can certainly have multi-unit buildings that fit within the fabric of an existing neighborhood. Beyond residential, we have mixed-use nodes, and there's that term nodes. Again, nodes are activity centers of the city, and we've identified 3 different types with neighborhood mixed-use nodes. These are, when you think of a node, think of kind of a larger site located in the strategic area of the city that could really become a hub of activity, an identifiable place within a neighborhood and a community. And these compact neighborhood centers can encompass a mix of land uses. And in the case of neighborhood mixed use nodes, those would be smaller scale buildings that are compatible with surrounding residential areas. Again, being sensitive to the 1-story, the 2-story, 3-story residential areas that lie around each of these urban districts, and thinking about how buildings step down and buffer these different areas is something that's important. That's something that we're thinking about. Next up, we have urban mixed-use nodes, which would be the dark purple areas of the city. Think of areas such as the strategic investment zone that is located on the south side of downtown, areas along the US 29 corridor that could support that urban mixed-use development that's much more intense than your neighborhood mixed-use node. And then, of course, we have downtown. It's probably one of the most identifiable existing nodes in the city, and that's a primary central activity area for the city residents. Here are a couple of the examples of that, and I have more imagery to describe these places, but overall, all of the nodes support commercial, employment, and residential activity, just at different scales and densities. And we would want to encourage a mix of uses in the same building or vertical mixed use. So you kind of see in the center picture where you have commercial, retail, restaurants, other active functions on the bottom floor, and then you have residential and office on the upper floor. So that you get a very dynamic, comfortable pedestrian environment, considering elements such as parks, open spaces, and plazas that create places within these different areas of the community is important as well. Again, similarly to the residential development, got to think about context, including that historic fabric, residential areas, environmental impacts, all are important when you think about density, particularly some of these more urban density land types. Heights range. Neighborhood mixed use nodes may vary up to 4 stories. 5 stories may be allowed in internal larger sites. And again, these are only ranges. We could ultimately end up with some districts that are only 2 stories high or 3 stories high. Be building into that flexibility so that when we get to zoning, we can get into more specifics of how different areas, these different nodes develop over time. Urban mixed use nodes, again, more intensive than your neighborhood mixed use nodes. These areas can range up to 5 to 8 stories, up to 10 stories where appropriate, and when comprehensive plan goals can be achieved, and of course, where it responds to existing residential, environmental, and historic areas of concern. And then downtown, heights in that district ranging from 2 to 6 stories, up to 10 stories where appropriate. And again, where it makes sense, where it fits within the existing urban fabric, historic context, and where the city's comprehensive plan goals can be achieved. Here are a couple of examples of neighborhood mixed use nodes. You can see these images range in character, they range in height and scale. So you can get a sense of what these areas could be. Some of these areas may be familiar to you. This is an image from Crozet. This is another image, if some of you are familiar with the Spotsylvania courthouse area, which has a evolving urban neighborhood mixed use district. So you can see these are places where you can go and get your pet supplies or get a cup of coffee or visit a retail establishment. They become anchors of the community, people places, and places where community residents want to be and enjoy and offer services for those surrounding neighborhoods. Next up, we have corridors. These areas are mixed use districts, very similarly to the nodes, but these corridors are areas that are more corridor oriented. Think of places like West Main, where you have kind of a tight development area. The buildings are generally located close to the street. As a good example, And we have two different scales of mixed use corridors, one being the neighborhood mixed use corridor, with again being lower scale and more contextual to the existing residential fabric. And then we have the urban mixed use corridors. These are areas that may include more intensively developed mixed use districts, again, supporting that retail, commercial, residential, office mix of uses as a major land use feature. And then also business and technology. As you all may be aware, there are a number of industrial or semi-industrial areas throughout the city. We know that that's a legacy land use that is very important, and it contributes greatly to the economic sustainability of the city. So we have included those land uses, those light industrial and production areas of the city as an important land use moving forward on the map. Here are a couple of examples of mixed use corridors. Again, neighborhood mixed use corridors being the lowest scale, contextual to the surrounding neighborhood fabric. Urban mixed use corridors, again, respecting the surrounding land uses, but offering more opportunity for greater density. This is an example along West Main Street. And then business and technology, mixed use, primarily for light manufacturing, semi-industrial uses, perhaps residential uses where it makes sense as an opportunity. As far as height, these different categories of land uses can range. Again, neighborhood mixed use corridors, they can range up to 5 stories. Again, in the zoning piece of this, we can end up with some neighborhood mixed use corridors that are only 2 or 3 stories. It's to be determined. We have to work through it to figure out the details of the different zones within the city. Urban mixed use corridors could range 5 to 8 stories, 8 stories, taller buildings at key intersections where appropriate. And then business and technology use, these anchor areas could range up to 6 stories in height. And again, here are a couple examples of mixed use corridors. You can see these developments are oriented towards the street corridors. They range in height and scale. You can see here we have some 2-story examples, 3 stories, 4 stories, 5-story examples. So they just become these anchor places within the community to create vibrant, walkable neighborhoods. So we touched on a lot of this, but I think it's worth reiterating. Development considerations for all of these different land use categories, height, making sure that height is used where appropriately and that it responds to the existing character and fabric of the city. Historic districts are not going anywhere. We see that those will continue, and that architectural controls will define important elements such as building setbacks, height step backs, height limitations, buffer, and other historic architectural features that are currently required in the zoning code. We see that continuing moving forward. We have to also think about the environmental issues, the critical slopes. Again, Charlottesville is not flat, so we have to think about how slopes impact the way we think about the city. Those critical waterways such as Rivanna River, Meadow Creek, Moores Creek, they're all important, and they're important environmental resources that we have to protect. Thinking about stormwater runoff, flooding, and of course, again, the tree canopy as well. With density comes transportation concerns. We understand that more density will lead to more opportunities to think about walkability, bikeability, transit, and access everywhere in the city. So that's something that goes hand in hand with development. That's something that we are not ignoring, and we will not ignore in the comprehensive plan. Just to compare the urban ring, again, I talked a lot about all of the different land uses that are proposed within the city boundaries. We also need to think about what's happening on outside of the city boundaries, and For this comparison, we included our draft future land use map overlaid on the urban ring. So you can see there is continuity as to how many of the mixed use districts, residential districts, parks and open spaces meet the county's boundary, which is good. And that's something that we want to plan for as well. Looking back at the 2013 plan, the 2021 plan, side-by-side comparisons, again, they look different. The 2021 plan has 9 land use categories. The future land use map in 2013 was very broad and included 5 land use categories. And I will note that for the future land use map, the low intensity included allocations for single 2-family residential development of up to 12 units per acre in the yellow was part of that vision plan. And then the high density residential areas were picturing residential development of 13 plus units per acre. Our draft 2021 plan, you can see on the right, is much more detailed. Again, you can see all of the 9 plus land use categories applied throughout the city. And we also have a chart that shows the land use designations that compared it to. Overall, we have more mixed use districts throughout the city than the 2013 plan. And of course, more definition in the residential development category, including that medium intensity residential category that was not shown in the 2013 map. So with that, I think I've talked enough. I'll turn it over to Jenny, who will walk through the evolution of the future land use map.
Thanks, Ron. And this will be fairly quick. We just wanted to clarify a few things. We know there may be some questions about how we made decisions to adjust things on the draft. The very first draft of the map from March to the draft that's out now. And so I want to walk through some of those. We met with the Planning Commission on March 30th to go over a first draft. We identified at that point, we knew there were some issues. For example, there were some spaces showing as green spaces when they are actually residential developments, including higher intensity residential developments. That was due to some the way we interpreted the parcel data. So we knew that would need to be cleaned up. And we knew that there were potentially other changes we were going to be making. So as you can see between the March 30th meeting on the left and the map that's out now on the right, one thing we did was adjust the colors. And we did that because we wanted to make sure it was clear sort of what the hierarchy was within the map. We want to make it a little easier to see. Another thing that we adjusted was the areas that on the March map we referred to as industrial mixed use, and in the May draft it's referred to as business and technology mixed use. And the reason we made that change was both to recognize there was not really a need to shift away from the language that was in the 2013 plan, which is business and technology, but also it may better represent sort of the overall vision that's provided in the description of that area. In addition to changing the color and the name of that category, we also adjusted sort of the level that's shown on the map. As you can see, sort of the 3 major industrial areas in the city. With all of those, we did show some additional options for these mixed use nodes, as well as housing that may be a good use as these areas move forward in the future. They may wish to potentially utilize that space for not only additional housing, but also for things like access to the river in the case of River Road. Another thing that we, as you can see, is different between the 2 maps is that we added additional nodes, the pink nodes. And the reason we did that was because we realized in a lot of the engagement we had last year, we heard that people want to be able to walk to, to the store to get groceries or to get other things they need, have some services they need on a regular basis. And so to better reflect that in the map, we showed throughout the map these nodes. We know there's some communities have had some concerns about these. And so we want to make sure that if we're showing that in a community, that it responds to what we're hearing. Let's see here, I'm making sure I don't miss anything. Regarding neighborhoods near UVA, I think Lewis Mountain, JPA, Venable. As you can see between the two maps, we did increase the residential intensity potential that we're showing along several parts of JPA, as well as expanding the area of medium intensity residential within Lewis Mountain. With both of those, we did have areas of medium intensity and high intensity residential on the March draft, but in considering, and same with in Venable, and then in considering discussions we've had with the Planning Commission, just in terms of thinking about UVA in general, and the area around UVA, we want to better reflect that these may be areas that where it might make sense to have more housing, both in terms of people who work at the university and the hospital, for example, who may not now be able to afford to live nearby, but also obviously considering that not all students are housed on campus. Let's see here. The other thing I'll note is that, as you can see, the medium intensity residential, the tan category expanded and changed a bit between the two maps. And so the one reason we did that was because we wanted to better address the goal to have expanded housing options throughout the city. Obviously, we know that the changing category with the general residential, allowing up to 3 units, is potentially a very large change for many areas in the city. But we thought it was important to provide some of those additional multi-unit opportunities throughout the city. And we focused largely along corridors for those to support the access to transit, as well as sort of walkability, bikeability. These along corridors, these can be focused areas for improvements that can improve transportation options. Let's see, Ron, am I missing anything on the map that you would like to point out?
No, I think you touched on the the major changes.
Okay, well, if there's other questions, we're happy to talk about those. But just a few more slides, if you wouldn't mind. So we're going to open up for some of your additional questions, but I want to reiterate that we do still have a couple of weeks until May 31st, which is currently the end of this public engagement period of this draft. There's a webinar on the 25th, and there's also the interactive map and the comment form, email, toll-free phone line. There are several ways folks can give their input. So we'd obviously encourage you to do that, but also we'd encourage you to share that if you haven't already with your communities. That being said, I think we can go to the next slide and I think address some questions. So let's see, I'm looking at the Q&A. We will also, after we respond to the Q&A, we will open it up for to bring some of you off mute to ask your questions directly. Let's see here. The first question I would like to respond to, and I'd love if Lee could also provide perhaps some response on this. Is there a reason why we're not offering specific guidance on how many units per acre, as opposed to a number of units per parcel? Or yeah, Lee or Ron, do you have thoughts on that?
Feel free to jump in, Ron. I was going to suggest that the key reason, especially at the lowest density, is that we are really looking at existing patterns of houses and lots and trying to allocate rights to them that could be used in the future. We're not talking about greenfields development or other sort of larger scale development that might be, measured more accurately by in the acres. We're talking about an in-town 5,000 square foot lot and what could be done on that. You'll see as the intensity changes, the approach to that changes as well. We are more likely to use the standards of urban form to guide how many units fit into an apartment building, for example, regulating the form more closely than necessarily the number of units. So there is less of a focus on what the total number of units is, and more of a focus on thinking about what the options are for embedding these things successfully into the existing neighborhoods.
Thanks, Lee. Let's see, the next question I'll propose that we respond to, which I'll read, is expanding high intensity residential on the basis of continuity into areas that are low density now seems to ignore the other stated goal of considering topography and protecting tree canopy in the Venable area. Since the March map, we've raised heights to 5 stories and proposed to allow that height to be built at Charlottesville's highest elevation. So how does this protect, or I guess I would say to respond to topography? So one thing we'd note is, or that I would note, and then I'd invite others to chime in as well, is that the heights, the maximum heights are shown more generally for all areas in the city. And as I think Ron has mentioned, it may be that as we move forward, these may not be appropriate in all areas of the city. Zoning will break down these land use areas into different categories. So it may be that the maximum height that we're listing for these land use categories on the comprehensive plan may not apply in all these areas in the city. But in general, related to topography, Lee or Ron, do you have thoughts on how the plan or the code might respond to topography in terms of the heights that are allowed?
So the city currently has a critical slopes ordinance that regulates development on critical slopes, which are, slopes within the city that are seem to be critical to the environment, particularly relating to runoff. We will conceivably continue ordinances of that nature as part of the upcoming zoning code, right? So again, weaving in that story of respecting the environment, being responsive to the environment as well. When we start thinking about setbacks, step backs, things like bulk plane, if you're familiar with those terms in the zoning code, those become important because they begin to regulate how buildings, for instance, if you have one parcel, if your backyard abuts an urban corridor that's higher than your house, and those regulations begin to dictate how those buildings meet the lot line and how those buildings begin to step down to the existing fabric. And then also, I think there was a question about the tree canopy as well. We want to encourage minimal tear down and demolition in some cases where, for instance, new urban infill, new development that may occur, particularly in some of the nodes, mixed use districts that we have ordinance in place that allows for the replanting of trees to continue to have the tree canopy thrive and provide opportunities for new canopy to develop throughout the city as well. So that's something very important and something that we're thinking about. And that's a very good question.
One small thing I'd like to add, Ron, and that is many people find it challenging, even with single family houses, with the upslope condition and the downslope condition. So the upslope house, if it's measured just once from the street, for example, will loom much higher than would the downslope house, which would be half buried. So considering how houses follow the topography, or larger buildings follow the topography will be very important. So rethinking the measurement of height may be one of the answers to that question.
Mhm.
All right, thanks. And the other part of this question I will respond to is why were changes incorporated since March? Some concerns about transparency about the justification for changes. And the question is whether we will anticipate giving more time to the process to fully incorporate residents' input. So the March draft was meant to be an interim draft to get feedback from the Planning Commission, and also to was to get feedback on the map. We knew that it wasn't the final map that was going to go out to the community, but it was meant as a point that we could gather some feedback while we're also considering changes. So the May version is the first full community review draft. We know if folks saw the March draft, it may be confusing that there's now a different draft that seems to have come very quickly. But we're hearing from people now, and we do intend to make sure we respond to what we're hearing. In terms of giving more time to the process, we are considering whether that how that may work with this process, or how we can best get feedback from folks, but I don't have an answer to that right now explicitly. Let's see, some questions from Hillary Murray with Lewis Mountain Neighborhood. One of her questions is, what is the current occupancy rate of all new builds across the city? And what is the current occupancy rate in all rental buildings across the city? I'm looking at the information I have from ESRI, which is they do forecasts based on census data. You may be familiar with them. And they say that in 2020, there are 93%, 94% of housing units are occupied, the 6% vacancy rate. And they project that the vacancy rate will go down a bit in the next 5 years. That's the information I have now. We can see if we're able to find additional information to respond to your question on that. The second question is, how does the plan address and incentivize affordable housing for developers and current property owners? Are there plans to incorporate new builds or current apartment buildings or new home builds into this plan to help address affordability? So the affordable housing plan that was created last year and then finalized in March lays out several different ways to incentivize affordability. One of the things we'll be looking at as part of the zoning rewrite is inclusionary zoning, which will require potentially housing units, potentially in exchange or incentivized by it could be, for example, inclusionary zoning often includes additional height. We don't know right now what the incentive might be, but that's something that we'll be looking into. The plan also includes recommendations about subsidies for developing affordable homes at certain levels, at specific levels of affordability. So I would encourage you, if you want, we have incorporated those recommendations into the housing chapter, but there are several others that you may be interested to look at as part of the affordable housing plan. I'm not sure I understand the rest of the question about incorporating new builds. Let's see. Are there plans to address current new builds or new builds built in the past 5 to 8 years to include units within walking distance to the epicenter of jobs to address this need? Address current new builds. I'm not sure. Does Ron or others have a response to this question? If not, we may need to ask you to potentially clarify your question there. I'm sorry. Oh,
Yeah, I think a clarification.
okay.
Yeah.
Let's see. Continuation of that. Oops, let's see. Oh, let's see. Hillary, I'm going to bring you off of mute if you want to unmute yourself.
Sure. Hi, sorry.
Hi, that's fine.
So my question was more so, it seems like there were a ton of new builds and that I don't know whether the SRI data is correct, but those new builds didn't take, like, for instance, in New York City, if you build a new place downtown, you have to have like 50% affordable housing units, and 50% can be, you know, more of a luxury price tag, and they just kind of make slight variations between the units. I didn't know, like, I've never seen the affordable housing plan that got passed, and I don't know where to find that. So if you could direct me there, that'd be very helpful, just because I don't see how the zoning is incorporating incentives to make housing affordable here.
Sure. And just, you know, as a reminder, that's currently looking at the land use plan, but we do have in the affordable housing plan, which I'll put a link to it, that does talk about how we might incorporate into the zoning. So let me see, I'll put that. I will add that as a response to your question here. All right. Let's see. Thanks, Hillary. Let's see, and while we are in there, I may suggest that perhaps Mr. Gray, I'm going to, let's see, you should be able to unmute yourself if you'd like to ask your question.
Super. Thank you for all your terrific work in developing the Affordable Housing Plan, which I believe is a very important and very well-crafted document that has real potential to impact Charlottesville in a very positive way. I'd like to point out that it's possible to agree enthusiastically with the Affordable Housing Plan and yet be very concerned about the comprehensive plan and the future land use plan. To this end, I very much appreciate your efforts to gather feedback from neighborhood associations. Could you please provide a specific example of an instance where a neighborhood association reached out to you with a concern and where you adjusted your future land use map in response? Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. So we are currently in a month-long, as you know, a month-long phase of community engagement, and that includes with neighborhood associations. So we have not been making revisions to the map during this month. Following this phase, we will be summarizing what we heard, and we will be very clear about the changes we're making to the map and how they connect to what we've heard. But we've not yet been making those changes during this month. Does that respond to your question?
Am I still muted? I don't know.
No, you're fine. I can hear you.
Okay, sorry. So thank you. I understand the word dialogue has been used many times, you know, in dialogue with the community. And it seems as though we may be in a situation where we provide input and then in the end, we see what you all decide, which doesn't sound like a dialogue. But anyways, thank you. I'll open it up to others. I appreciate you taking my question.
Sure. We're in the phase of dialogue now, just to reiterate. So, you know, I do want to make sure that we're very clear after this this month. You know, what do we hear? That'll be provided in both summary form and in full comments for an appendices, so folks can look at them as well. And then we'll work to be very clear about how we're connecting what we heard to the changes. Just to reiterate. So, thank you, Peter. Let's see. Oops, sorry. Let's see here. All right, sorry, I lost my windows for a second. Let's see, I think, Mr. Gray, I see you had a couple questions up here as well. I think we just spoke about this question of how we're being responsive to the concerns of citizens. You know, again, we'll be taking the input that we're gathering, including this meeting and the pop-up meetings we had this weekend, where we heard from many folks, I think, in the neighborhoods you live in, all of you on this call, and the survey and the interactive map. And we're pulling that all together to share that with the Planning Commission and our steering committee and others to use that as we move forward. Let's see. let's see, I'd like to respond to this question from Len. The consultants have mentioned signature placemaking buildings, possibly at the maximum heights at the nodes. And Len notes a concern that some of these nodes are at high points, such as the Barracks Mason Rugby Extended intersection, and that a 5-story building there will tower over the entire city. So, you know, it might be a signature building, but do we want to put it there if it sort of feels like it's looming? Or I added the word looming, you didn't say that, but I think what we've heard certainly is that there are examples in the city where people do feel like it's, you know, these buildings are sort of, use it again, looming over them. And that's not what we want. We know that these buildings, if they're up high, they'll be very visible. I think that will need to be taken into account in terms of what's you know, allowed in, or maybe need to take it into account with what's allowed in the zoning. But we could also look to address that in the comprehensive plan, talking about, you know, I think we've often thought more about or heard more about topography in terms of adding additional height in areas that are lower. But I think your point is well taken, and the points others have made that we may need to look for more guidance or add more guidance around what happens at the maximum heights in terms of topography. Ron, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that's right. And, you know, we describe opportunities for the mixed-use nodes and the corridors to have those taller buildings at intersections as opportunities for placemaking. We have to define what those key intersections are as well. So one of the considerations in the definition of a key intersection should perhaps be that topography, height, views inward, outward should be an important consideration of what defines a key intersection that may be appropriate for additional height.
All right, thanks. Let's see. Sorry, I'm trying to, I know we won't get to all questions before we go, but so one thing I would note is that if, please feel free to keep submitting your questions and comments in the Q&A, and we do commit to both providing those as part of the community engagement phase, that's sort of the summary, but we'll also make sure to reach out to you with responses. I'm trying to make sure we're responding to questions from all folks. Let's see here. So one question that I think we should answer here is the presentation understandably presents attractive buildings as examples of the various land use types, but then we note that zoning does not dictate architectural form, which I think, Lee, it'll be good to have you respond to this. I'll just note right now as I continue to read it. So it continues that it sounds like the presentation could just as accurately be showing unattractive, cheaply constructed buildings for each land use type. So the question is really what controls will a city have outside of historic designated areas to keep these unattractive buildings, cheaply constructed buildings from becoming a reality? And how does the city get the buildings designed to fit into the surroundings if it otherwise qualifies under the zoning code? So Lee, do you have thoughts you'd like to share on that one?
Well, there's kind of two things that we can say. One is, if my recollection is accurate, we have no ability outside a historic district to regulate materials. So that will be continue to be a challenging issue. How materials are used is not something the state allows you to regulate. Because of that, we focus a whole lot on the form of new development, on making sure that we have, roof forms and articulation and windows and doors and those kinds of things. But yes, it is possible that you could end up with some cheap construction.
Thanks. And I guess the sort of follow-up or another piece of that was that if the city, and you may have already responded to this, if the city were to be able to make sure buildings are well built and designed like the ones we're showing, does it make them less affordable?
So the city could, of course, use its affordability money that it's committed to assist in providing affordability. In the long run, the better built house is actually more long-term sustainable, resilient, and affordable. In the short term, perhaps not on day one. So those questions will have to be sort of asked and answered as we move forward. But there may not be any controls within zoning that we can apply to ensure we get a well-built or necessarily well-designed building. Those are questions of taste. We do anticipate that in many instances, the Board of Architectural Review will continue to be operating in the city as it does today.
Okay, thanks, Lee. Let's see. I have a few questions from Robert Ramsey. One question is on process, noting that a lot of residents he's talked to has been completely blindsided by these changes to the land use map, and asking why we waited to reach out to neighborhood associations. I would note we have reached out via email to neighborhood associations at each of the major engagement phases to send information. So that is something that we recognize. We know that you all are connected to folks in your neighborhood, and that's a good way to reach out. So I think moving forward, we should continue to meet with this group more specifically in a meeting like this. I think this is a good way to have back and forth discussion that makes that process even stronger of you reaching out through your communities. Second question is, what are the underlying population growth assumptions informing this comprehensive plan and land use plan? And noting that population growth in Charlottesville has been measured for a long period of time. So we are initially using the Cooper Center population projections, which I will double check, even though I think I know what it says. And so that the UVA Weldon Cooper Center projects population of about 50,000 for 2020, and a population of about 53,000 in 2040. But what we've heard with that is that there is perhaps assumptions that are not specific to Charlottesville enough to really reflect, potential growth that could be happening. So that's only one piece of the puzzle that we're thinking about with growth. The other thing that we are taking into account is, as we saw on the housing slide, one of the slides earlier, was that there has been a affordability need that's been identified through the housing needs assessment, I think 2017 or 2018, and that identified a number of units, around 3,300, that were needed, affordable units that were needed, and that includes includes things like existing units that need to be improved, as well as potential additional units that may be needed, for example, for very low incomes. And so we are working both under the projected need for that affordable housing need, as well as the overall housing need. So what we've tried to do is to lay out a framework that can try to structure that accommodates that, both the growth needed and the change needed in terms of affordable units. Let's see. Robert asks what an appropriate population density is for a city like Charlottesville. I would not personally have a specific number to identify on that. We've heard that people would like to see things like more grocery stores in their neighborhood, for example, or more faster transit, more transit service. And so some of those things certainly are bolstered by having additional population density. So in terms of the other question that asks if we've sought input from residents on the point of population density, we haven't asked specifically about what folks see as an ideal population, but we have gotten feedback that supports that people want to see these services and amenities that would be supported by higher, potentially increased population density. And then the last piece of that question from Robert that I respond to is how many residents in the shaded pink and brown neighborhoods did we consult with before changing the March draft to the present document? The changes that were made between March and May, did not include specific outreach to neighborhoods. We wanted to do the outreach to neighborhoods and the community in general during this phase, this May engagement phase. You know, there are changes throughout the map, and so we wanted to come out to the community more broadly to get that input. Let's see here. Let's see, I'll respond to a question from Paul. Can we clarify, excuse me, the percent of public participation during the public engagement period? And given the pandemic, do we think we've obtained sufficient public input? So we've got, if you look at the website, we have the summaries from the, it was May and June 2020 community input period. I think it was about 5 weeks. And then in October, November, or I think it was through November, there was the second phase of community input. And so we have summaries from those on the website. I don't have the percentage off the top of my head, but I'd be happy to find that in the documents. But, you know, it has, doing outreach has not been very easy in the same ways that we're used to doing it during the pandemic. Our initial approach to this project involved, you know, being out face-to-face with folks. So we worked to adapt that. We provided a lot of opportunities to do virtual engagement, small group discussions, you know, meeting with folks throughout the process, as well as, you know, including things like the phone line that people can call into, additional outreach through door hangers and signage and whatnot. So I think we've worked to achieve public input. The pandemic has certainly thrown a, you know, some issues at us, like it has for, I think, everything. Let's see. Sorry if it seems I'm skipping around. I'm just trying to make sure I'm responding to questions from all folks who submitted them. It's a question about what is the process for getting questions and others we're getting through the engagement process addressed and shared with the community. And noting that some in the Belmont Carlton neighborhood are wondering if extending the community review process or adding a second phase might help before we finalize the map. Excuse me. So we'll be, you know, we gathered we're gathering comments and questions via email, via webinars, via phone. I mean, all the ways that we're showing here on the slide. And so we are getting a lot of questions. And so we will be looking to address those questions. We don't have a specific timeline here, but we will be definitely responding to them in the summary of engagement that goes out at the end of the engagement period. And we'll be working through the questions to try to respond to them in the next couple of weeks as well during the engagement period. But, you know, questions will still come in toward the end of that as well. So we may not be able to respond to all of them during May. But to your second point of extending the review process, we'll be meeting with NDS this week to talk about moving forward what the process might be, and that may include a discussion of you know, what we've heard so far and whether we need to potentially consider extending or adding another phase. Let's see, I see we are at 5 o'clock. I know there are a lot of other questions here. So we will commit to, I'm happy to commit to responding to these questions that you all have sent by next week at the latest, because I know these may be questions you've heard from others in your community as well. We want to make sure that we're clearing these up as we can. But I guess before we wrap up, I would first of all thank you all for spending time to come out and talk with us. We hope you'll continue to reach out with your comments and questions and concerns, and that you'll encourage folks to submit their comments, written comments. We'll be taking everything we're getting and summarizing it and sharing it in full where we can, so that everyone knows what we've been hearing. And so it's important to submit your comments, whether in any of these ways, by email, the interactive map, or the comment form. But before we wrap up, would anyone like to add anything, Alex or Missy or others from NDS?
Well, the only thing we can add is encouraging folks to go to the website and provide feedback, and to stay engaged in the process, as we move forward.
Okay. Well, thank you again, everyone. Latoya just put the email for any additional questions, so please feel free to send those along, and we'll be working to respond to them. So thank you very much.